will now hear from the Planning Department.
All right. Good evening, President Trasvina and Commissioners. Corey Teague, Zoning Administrator with the Planning Department. As we've heard, this is a jurisdiction request tonight and not an appeal of the actual determination, so I will just be speaking on the issues of the jurisdiction request itself. And as we said, the standard is whether or not the city intentionally or inadvertently prevented the requester from filing a timely appeal. We've heard that it seems like the intent of the requester with the BBN filing was to get that notice, but few points that are important to point out. First of all, for under the planning code, there's no required notice of any kind when letters of determination are issued. However, it has been our practice to do courtesy notices when we issue LODs to the property owner when the LOD is for a specific property and the property owner was not the requester. And then also we do have a process where neighborhood groups or citywide groups can register with the department as kind of registered neighborhood groups. And when we issue LODs, we do send out copies to all of those groups. So in this case, we did have like 47 different groups that were sent copies of this letter when it was issued. And that included Tenderloin Housing Clinic and both D5 and D6 supervisors' offices, as well as many others. And so what this is really coming down to is, again, the Black Book Notice, which is we call it just a BBN for short, which they did file last year. But it is important to notice that the BBN process is not a code process. It's purely a department policy that we've had for a long time, which essentially allows anyone from the public to put this request on a property and receive notices for certain types of permit applications. And that's really the rub. Like, we've never sent copies of LODs to BBN requesters because the BBN is specific for like development applications and permits, et cetera. And that's what's called out in the BBN application. And then specifically, our letters of determination have a disclaimer at the bottom that kind of say this is not that. They say this is not an authorization to do work. If you need permits or other authorizations, you need to go do that separately. That's not what a letter of determination is. It's really, in this case, was just a determination of what is the existing legal use. There was no request of anything to change. It was just a reconfirmation of what the existing use is. As was mentioned, I did provide an email response to the requester on April 16th, kind of outlining all of these things. I did say that happy to take this feedback to department leadership to see if they want to include LODs in the BBNs going forward. No decision has been made on that. But I think the key here is just there was definitely nothing done differently and definitely not on purpose to prevent the requester from receiving notice. Everything was done the way we handle all LODs and we have for some time. But I'm available for any additional questions you may have.
Thank you. We do have a question from President Trasvina, but before we begin, all the folks in front of the door, please move against the wall. We have to keep the door open for the fire egress. Sorry for sounding like a broken record. But okay.
Thank you, Mr. Teague. I do have a few questions. Does Ms. Laborde, the day after the letter of determination, would she have had the right to appeal to us over the letter?
Yes. Once the letter was issued, there was a 30-day appeal period where anyone could file an appeal.
Anyone at all, or anyone with a particular interest?
Anyone could file an appeal within those 30 days.
Okay. And how are they notified of their right to appeal?
Well, again, there's the planning code and other city codes don't necessarily require notice of permits and other things that are appealable just because they are appealable. As I mentioned in the code, there's no notification requirement at all for letters of determination when they're issued. The kind of courtesy notice process that we do is what I explained, which is the property owner and then the registered neighborhood groups.
So the city doesn't notify people of their right, even though they have a right to appeal?
In many different situations, we have like same thing with a building permit. Like anybody can appeal a building permit. They don't have to be an adjacent property owner or whatever. And obviously, we don't do citywide notification of building permits. Yeah.
We don't do citywide notification. I've heard expressed this courtesy notice, but it's not courtesy. It's not required, but it's based upon an expression of interest by that neighborhood organization and citywide organization, right? Is that a better way of characterizing it?
Yes, I mean, to be on that list, it is certified neighborhood organizations that when there is notice, they want to be included in that notice.
And how do they notify you that they want to be notified in general? There's a BBN for other things. How do you get on that list?
There is a process through the department. I honestly can't remember the minimum thresholds for a group to qualify as a neighborhood group or an organization to be on the list, but there's an application process through the department, and there's a fee associated with that, just like annually to stay on that list.
So there's a fee for the BBN. So Ms. Laborde paid money and stated, I have an interest in 111 Taylor.
Correct.
So I want you to notify me. And then there's another list to get on where you pay a separate fee to get the LOD notification.
Well, that list is technically they don't get on that list as a neighborhood organization to get LOD notifications. I mean, it's just to be notified anything that is sent out for notice by the department in that neighborhood area.
And it's only for certain organizations, not an individual.
Correct.
Okay, great. And what does the recipient of the letter of determination, what rights does that property have with the letter that weren't existent prior to the letter?
Well, again, I mentioned anyone can appeal. So there have been letters of determination where the requester or the property owner disagreed with the determination, and so they also have the right to appeal.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant was, for this particular letter, Ms. Laborde said that they needed the letter to go to the state, to the federal government, to continue with their operations. I wanted to get an understanding from the city as to what the impact of this letter of determination is.
Sure. I would have to defer that question to the requester because that's regarding, we do have some facilities that either based on the how they're regulated at the state or federal level or the funding they receive at the state or federal level, they're required to get certain kind of determinations from the city about their zoning and legal uses. I don't know the exact nature of that requirement for this facility or the timing related to that because that's purely on their end. For us, it's just the request for this determination specifically and then the issuance of that determination.
Okay, thanks. It's very helpful. I yield to Commissioner Swig.
So was Ms. Laborde a known interested party to yourself during this process and prior to the letter of determination in question being issued?
Do you mean me specifically or the department or?
Was she known to the department or you specifically as a very interested party in this project?
Sure. To me specifically, no. And then for any time there's any notice conducted by the department for anything that we do noticing for, we have support staff that have procedures that they follow for that. In this case, like I said, support staff, when they go to do the notices that we do for LODs, they don't look at the BBNs because those aren't covered by that. So we had the BBN. It was listed there. If you look on our website on the parcel information map, you can see the BBN, and it calls out like building permits, conditional uses, variances, things like that. So there wouldn't be an understanding by the support staff to include any BBN requester in an LOD notice.
Yeah, that to me is I like you a lot and I respect you a lot. So the following comment is meant to be snarky in just the chip on my shoulder that sometimes I have about bureaucracies. So the answer you just gave me was a great bureaucratic answer, and it was appropriate to how the city runs its business. However, we are people. We're not bureaus. Ms. Laborde is a person. She is not a bureau. And we have had many people in these hearings, next door neighbors, people from around the corner, who've been upset about certain things, and they make themselves very known to staff, very known maybe to yourself, but they make themselves very known as interested party, and we get to know them. We get to know them when they come here for the Board of Appeals very well. In fact, we're going to have something later tonight which is very known to all of us, and it's public information because it's been in the newspaper a couple times. All right? So we know interested parties. And what I'm trying to determine here, there's the bureaucratic answer, you just gave it to me. But there's also the people answer. And Ms. Laborde, she seemed to be, to me, in reading the documents, to be a known person of interest with this project. And what I'm trying to get over, if she's such a known person of interest in this project, and the notice of the letter of determination goes to the local supervisors, and sometimes we know where those sit, on somebody's desk unread, because they get a stack of them and they can't go through everything. Or it goes to local interest, maybe interested agencies, and the same thing sits on somebody's desk and they can't get to it. But the active person in the whole system, which I would qualify Ms. Laborde as the active person in this system, she gets leapfrogged. And she's the example in this particular case, but it's happened before. That the person with the most interest, the person with the most traction in the activity, the activist in the activity gets leapfrogged and not informed by, as a courtesy, by staff as to probably the most important action taken by the city in her case. How am I supposed to process that in the context of your bureaucratic answer? The people versus the bureaucratic answer. Why wasn't the person who's taken the most personal action in this activity, how is that person leapfrogged and not informed? This is where I'm wrestling with, the staying in the lane of inadvertent or by mistake or whatever action the city aired.
Sure. And I feel like, if you stand up here and you talk about the different procedures that apply and how some don't and some do, all right, obviously that's always going to sound somewhat bureaucratic, so I completely understand that. Yeah. I mean, the key distinction here, and obviously folks can disagree on this distinction, but the way we've operated at the department since we've had the Black Book notation is, again, there's a distinction between development applications, so people actually coming in and making a proposal to do something. And that's what the BBN was for. It's like you're going to have a building expansion, you're going to, a new project, whatever that may be, or you have a project that requires to go to Planning Commission. That's what the BBN was set up for, to provide notice for. The letters of determination just never fell within that category and were never included there. And so that is the distinction. So, I think people can obviously look at it and say, well, it'd make more sense to me if they were included. And that's a fair comment. But in terms of, did the city do anything differently in this case that it does for all letters of determination, right, that would have prevented the requester from filing an appeal? That answer is no. We process this the same way we process all of our letters of determination.
Yeah, and I think that's the rub here that I'm, week after week I'm always the one who cites the law, and that we have to abide by the law. So that's where the rub is. My question to you is that the Ms. Laborde was led to believe that not maliciously, people in your department are just fine people. They're not out to get anybody. But she was led to believe without some level of clarity that by registering on the BBN, that she would be able to stay up with this project. And so She probably, I'm putting myself in her place. She probably looked on the BBM website, looking. Meanwhile, because the city process is what it is, there's the rub. It never got shown on the BBN website, and she was never informed that she could look for the rest of her life. It's never going to show up. She was not informed about that. And that's, how do we get around that? How do we process that as not being inadvertent or a mistake by the city?
Sure. I mean,
When she's known as an active, and she had actually reached out, asked somebody, how do I stay involved? And they said, go BBN.
Sure. Obviously, I don't know what the interaction was. I mean, all I know is that, obviously she has stated that it was her understanding that the BBN would provide her, would allow her to be noticed for the letter of determination. I'm not aware that that information was provided to her by anyone, because again, we don't do that. The BBN calls out the specific types of things you get noticed for, and it's not on there. I'm sure going forward, we can, the department can make a decision, either include them in the BBN or be very clear in the application form that they're not included, so that people are extremely clear about that. But again, the only thing I would clarify a little bit, the question of like a known person being very interested. I mean, when someone files an application and information gets added to the website, again, that doesn't mean that there were planners or people were sitting around thinking like, oh, here's this person we know who is interested. It's just part of the system. That's why I was saying, like, I wasn't personally aware. The support staff who processed the letter were not personally aware of this person and their interests. So I just want to be very clear not to have it characterized in that way, because that's really not what it is. It was just, it sounds like someone filed a routine application for something that they thought it was, and it wasn't that. And then the people on the city side did what they always do, and there was a disconnect.
Yeah, and I understand that. I'm clear on that. And I also look in this audience, and if I ask people to raise their hand, is this the first time you've been here? Please raise your hand. I would bet you that I'd get a majority, and the majority of people aren't, and nor was I when I walked in here for the first time a decade ago,
Sure.
with all the rules and regs, and I still don't know everything. Rules and regs around stuff. So I sometimes wonder how we inform the public appropriately, so inadvertently or otherwise, the city doesn't inform them as to things that are really, really important to them that they've talked to the city about. But I'll pass it along. Thank you very much for your testimony. I really appreciate it, and I'll pass it on to Commissioner Lopez.
Thank you. A couple of follow-up questions. So the distinction between what's included in the BBN and what's not, you spoke about, essentially development actions, right? Imminent development permits, I'm assuming variances, conditional use, authorization. So, but in my mind, an LOD can often and potentially can change the character of what type of development may occur at a site. Is that not right?
I'm not sure if I would say that's completely accurate. I mean, an LOD is always just going to answer a question, right? The role of the zoning administrator is to interpret the code, and sometimes the code's not easily interpreted, right? And it's not clear, and people have the right to put in writing a request to answer this question. And it may be about a specific property. It may be about a specific, potential development. It may be about a specific company and not even, not a specific property. And it's just a question of how does the code apply here in this scenario? So that's where the distinction is that you can't take a letter of determination and go build anything, right? Because it's not a development application. We do this informally every day, right? People who don't request for a formal determination, phone calls, emails, we give people code interpretations informally every day. This is just the written version of that. Now, obviously, that information answers a question that then can be used to do something on the property, right? Although in this case, just a distinction is that this this letter of determination was not about a specific development proposal. It's just a question of what is the existing use of the property.
Right, I understand in this case, but I mean, we've had parties come before us with LODs that say, "Hey, I'm eligible for this type of project because I fit this, land use category within this district." I mean, that even though it's not directly, it's not a permit, right? But it can be a necessary condition for someone to file a permit for a development, right?
Well, it just, again, letters of determination are not required. They're purely optional for people who want that formal determination, right? There may be a question about how the planning code applies to their property, and the vast majority of people get that information informally, again, just through verbally or through email. But if you want it in writing, and the distinction there is that it is then appealable, then that's the process you go through. Again, the LOD itself is not going to authorize any actual work or development.
Got it. And then with respect to the courtesy registration process, and it sounds like that's also, I'm assuming like the BBN is not a creature of code. That seems like a creature of practice. Is that right?
Absolutely. The BBN is not a code requirement. It's purely a department policy. The department tomorrow could decide to amend it or take it away or expand it. It's pure policy.
And with respect to that, when you say organizations, can you just give us some color on like what type of organization or group would be eligible for that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, your typical kind of neighborhood associations. It's definitely designed to be for actual groups and organizations and not for individual persons. And so, again, there is like a little bit of an application process to demonstrate that you are like a group representing some form of persons. Again, I don't have with me the exact thresholds for that. But we do have requirements when there is code required notification. So here we talk a lot about 311 notification for permits. The code does require us to send the notice to those groups. So they're part of the required notice kind of environment. But we do have different things that we do in the department that don't require notice under the code. We don't have to provide any notice to anyone. And over time, we may change our policies just internally to include these groups in that notice because we have that information available.
And you said that's typically for like a neighborhood or a district and not for a specific property.
Right. So we have the city is divided into a number of different neighborhoods, and again, not real estate boundary neighborhoods, kind of just neighborhoods we use for noticing purposes. And so if you're a neighborhood group specific to like this area in our notification map is the Civic Center area. And so there are a group of organizations that are specific to that area. And so if there's a development application getting noticed, like, in the Sunset, they're not going to get a notice for that. But if it's in the boundaries of that Civic Center area, they will get noticed. And then we have some organizations that are specifically citywide, and they get a copy of everything, regardless of the geography.
Got it. And then with respect to, public-facing information on the BBN, what can you describe that or show us any evidence that you have of that? Like, what if I go sign up for a BBN? How do I know what's in and what's out?
Sure. I don't have a physical copy, but I have it pulled up on my computer. I could show you. But there's the two main things are there's an application that you file, and the application kind of goes into like what is a BBN, like what happens, and so that's the information where it kind of explains what to expect. And then once you have a BBN filed, so we have our PIM, our property information map, and we have different tabs for information. The very last tab is for BBNs. And so if a BBN is active for a property, it'll show up there, and it provides basically the name and the contact information for who filed that BBN. And then it also provides like a general description of the types of things they'll be notified for.
And on that, I'm assuming it does not say LOD. Correct. Or that an LOD is excluded.
Right. Yeah. Very specifically, letters of determination are not listed in the application form, and they're not listed on the website.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. Vice President Epler?
Thank you. I'm going to drill down just a little bit further into a couple of Commissioner Lopez's questions. On the issue of to be abundantly clear, notifications to neighborhood groups of letters of determination, that's purely discretionary by the department and not in the code itself.
Correct. The code requires no notice at all.
Right. And with respect to letters of determination that may affect a zoning district within a neighborhood but are not tied to any particular address, those wouldn't go to the neighborhood. Those would just go to the citywide groups.
Right. So we get some letters of determination that are specific to a property. And when that happens, obviously that anchors you in one of the neighborhood areas. And so anytime we have one of those LODs like this one, we would send the notice to the neighborhood groups in that area and the citywide groups. When sometimes we get a letter of determination request that's basically, this is our business, what land use would we be, right? Would we be an office? Would we be a laboratory? Whatever it may be, but it's not specific to any property. So when we issue those, we send that. There's no property owners. We don't do that. We do the citywide groups, the neighborhood groups that are registered for the full city.
I guess my question is, you do say that this isn't a letter of determination, isn't a license to do something, but it is a kind of a change in the bundle of rights that a landowner has, whether it's for a specific site or a specific zoning district.
I would argue it's slightly different. It's interpreting what their existing rights are, right? It's not providing them anything that doesn't already exist under the code. It's just providing clarity.
Yeah, it's a change in risk, because if it were something that was abundantly clear on the face of the code, there'd be no letter of determination asked usually. If it's something that's a little bit more edgy and someone might not do it because of the risk, but they ask for it and they get the right, then their bundle of rights is changed because they know that they have clearance to go forward.
Their certainty is different.
Yes.
Correct.
Right. And so I guess, my question is, how has the policy whereby notification happens just kind of grown haphazardly within the department, or is there any rationale? Because it seems like certain interested parties, as Commissioner Swig pointed out, do not get notice, like say on a particular parcel if they're just on the BBN. Certain groups don't get notice if it's a generic question that affects the land that they own, but they're not, there's no BBN and they're not part of a neighborhood group. Neighborhood groups who have, or neighborhoods that have a particular zoning district don't get the notification if it's not tied specifically to a project within the neighborhood, but we do get it if it's in the neighborhood. It seems like a very haphazard set of notifications.
Well, there was a lot there. I'm not sure if the best way to get, I could take those a little bit more one by one, but I guess to me, I think there's a little bit more of a logic there to that. Because again, if there's an anchor property, then it's all about proximity, right? So if it's a project that requires notice under the code, we're going to have an anchor property, and then there's going to be a radius, right? And then obviously then you're in a specific neighborhood, a mapped neighborhood, and those all get those. I think if I understand your comment and your question, it's more about sometimes people request determinations that are broader, like they're not specific to a geography. They're answering a question about how the planning code applies to a scenario or a situation or a business, and obviously that can have implications in lots of different places, just depending on what the question is. And I say that's why in those scenarios, there's not a specific property to anchor any notification to, and so we only notify the groups, the neighborhood groups that have registered for citywide. They want to get anything in the city.
But even when there is an anchor, if it's just a BBN instead of being a neighborhood group, you don't get notice of the letter of determination.
Correct. So if it's a BBN, right, this does not include a letter of determination.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions. I assume DBI won't be weighing in. Okay, so we're going to move on to public comment. How many people in the room are here for public comment? Please raise your hand. Okay, and I see that we have more than 20 people on Zoom, so President Trezvina. given that we have other items on the agenda here and the high volume of people, I recommend we limit public comment to 1 minute.
And we've also had extraordinarily complete presentations in writing and orally by the city and by the requester.